She was 26 years old when she walked into a congressional office in Washington, D.C., with no connections, no family in politics, no obvious path, and no particular reason for anyone inside that building to take her seriously. She came from Canyon City, Colorado. Her grandfather was a rancher. She had attended a small state university. She did not go to Georgetown, or Harvard, or Yale. She did not have the credential pedigree that Washington uses to sort the people it will take seriously from the people it will not. None of it mattered. Because the thing that would carry her from a congressional mailroom to the podium of the White House briefing room to the anchor desk of one of the most watched morning shows in American television was not a credential. It was a quality. A specific, rare, almost impossible to manufacture quality of communicating under pressure in a way that made the most complicated, contentious situations feel somehow navigable. She became the White House press secretary for George W. Bush. She was the second woman ever to hold that position. She stood at that podium during some of the most contested and painful moments in modern American political history, and she answered questions every day, on camera, in front of a press corps whose job was to find the crack in the answer without losing the composure, the warmth, or the essential human quality that made people, regardless of their politics, believe she was giving them everything she actually had. And nobody who watched it knew the half of what it was costing her. Have you ever performed a role that required complete confidence while privately managing a level of doubt and personal loss that the performance was specifically designed not to show? That question is not about politics. It is the question underneath Dana Perino's entire public career. And the answer, when you follow the story all the way to where it leads, is one of the more genuinely instructive things in American public life. It is September 2007. The James S. Brady Press Briefing Room, Washington, D.C. Dana Perino has been White House press secretary for approximately 48 hours. She is standing at the podium. The press corps is in front of her. The questions coming at her are not gentle. The Iraq War is at the center of every question, every follow-up, every attempt to find the contradiction or the evasion or the thing that hasn't been said. The previous press secretaries, Tony Snow, Scott McClellan, have each left the position with their public reputations damaged in ways that the position itself seemed designed to produce. She is 35 years old. She is in one of the most visible and most pressurized communications roles in the world. She has a husband who has been managing the demands of a marriage to a woman whose schedule, travel, and emotional bandwidth have been consumed entirely by the White House for years. She has a life she has been deferring in ways she cannot yet fully name. She steps to the microphone. She answers every question. And the quality that the press corps and the television viewers and the political observers note, the quality that will define her tenure at the podium and that she will carry into every subsequent role, is a quality that looks like serenity. It is not serenity. It is something more expensive than serenity. This story does not begin at the podium. It begins in a small town in Colorado, in a childhood that built the instrument before anyone had a context in which to use it. Pull back far enough from the White House and the Fox News anchor desk, and the best-selling books, and the decades of public communication that have made her one of the most recognizable faces in American media, and you find the beginning. Not the polished, retrospectively inevitable beginning of a success narrative. The actual beginning, with its specific combination of genuine ambition, geographic disadvantage, and the specific quality of person that small Western towns sometimes produce. Dana Marie Perino was born on May 9, 1972, in Evanston, Wyoming, and grew up in Parker, Colorado, a small city southeast of Denver that was, in the 1970s and 1980s, genuinely rural in its texture and its values, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors' livestock by name. Where the work ethic was not a motivational concept but a daily physical reality, and where the expectation was that you would become the kind of person who contributed. Her family was not political. Her grandfather, Leo Perino, was a cattle rancher whose relationship with the land was practical and total, a man who understood the American West not as a symbol, but as a working environment. Her parents were not Washington insiders or media personalities or public figures of any kind. They were people who went to work and came home and raised their children with the expectation that those children would also go to work and come home and do something useful with their lives. She fell in love with communication early. Not with politics, with the specific act of talking about complicated things in ways that made them clear. She watched news broadcasts and found herself interested not in the content alone, but in the mechanics of how the content was being delivered. She was, from early on, someone who paid attention to the craft of public communication with the specific attention of someone who intended, eventually, to practice it. She attended Colorado State University Pueblo, a small state school that did not have the name recognition of the institutions that produced most Washington careers. She studied mass communications. She was good at it, genuinely good, in the way that separates students who understand the material from students who are building something durable from the material. The path to Washington was not smooth, and it was not given. She graduated. She moved to Washington with almost nothing. She knocked on the door of a congressional office with a resume that was not going to distinguish her from the hundreds of other ambitious young people who arrived in Washington every year, believing they were going to matter. She got a job as a staff assistant in the office of Representative Scott McInnes of Colorado. She answered phones. She sorted mail. She attended to the ordinary, unglamorous, foundational work of someone who has decided to be useful before they are important. She was useful. She was also paying attention to everything. Have you ever started somewhere so far below where you intended to end up that the starting place itself felt like an argument against the destination and kept going anyway? Not because the evidence supported the persistence, but because something in you refused to accept the evidence as the final word? That is the texture of Dana Perino's early years in Washington. Not the triumphant arrival of someone who was always going to matter. The unglamorous persistence of someone who decided she was going to matter and then went about proving it in the smallest possible increments. The trajectory from congressional staff assistant to White House press secretary took about 15 years and involved a series of moves that are, in retrospect, clearly building towards something, but that, in the moment of each move, were simply the next available step toward useful work. She worked her way through positions in Congress, learning the specific mechanics of how legislation is communicated, how public statements are made, how the gap between what a government does and what the public understands about what a government does is managed by the people whose job is to manage it. The work was not glamorous. It was also not a detour, it was the education. She went to the Department of Justice during the first George W. Bush administration, working in the Office of Public Affairs. The DOJ position required a different kind of communication than Capitol Hill, less partisan, more institutional, the specific discipline of representing an institution whose authority depended partly on public trust and whose communications had to honor that dependence. She was good at it. The goodness was noticed. She moved to the White House Council on Environmental Quality as a deputy communications director. She became a deputy press secretary in the White House press office, working under Scott McClellan in the years when the Iraq War was dominating every briefing and when the press corps's questions were increasingly impossible to answer with anything the administration was prepared to say. She watched Scott McClellan navigate the briefing room through those years. She watched what the position required and what it cost. She watched a person of genuine talent and commitment be worn down, over time, by the specific grinding pressure of standing between an administration and a press corps in a period of maximum political conflict. She was learning, watching McClellan, not just the mechanics of the role, but its human cost. When Tony Snow took over from McClellan in 2006, the relief was palpable. Snow was a broadcaster, a communicator by training and temperament, someone who could hold the briefing room in a way that McClellan's quieter personality had not. But Snow was also, from the beginning of his tenure, managing a cancer diagnosis that eventually required him to step back. In 2007, Tony Snow stepped down. Dana Perino was named to replace him. She was the second woman ever to serve as White House press secretary. The first was Dee Dee Myers under President Clinton. The distance between those two women, in terms of the political landscape and the specific nature of the pressures the position required, was considerable. What they shared was the specific challenge of being a woman in a role that had been defined by men, in a room full of people whose job was to find the weakness in whatever she offered. She stepped into the role in September 2007. The Iraq War was in its fifth year. The Bush administration's approval ratings were in a range that made every press briefing a live combat exercise in which the press corps' job was explicitly adversarial. She was standing at the podium for a president and an administration that the majority of the American public at that moment did not support. She stood at the podium every day. She answered every question. She did not pretend the questions were easy. She did not patronize the press corps with non-answers disguised as answers. She gave what she had, which was an honest accounting of what she knew and what she didn't know, and what she was willing to say about the gap between them. The press corps, which was not, by any reasonable description, predisposed to give her easy treatment, respected her for it. Not universally, not uncritically, but the specific quality of her presence at the podium, the combination of preparation, composure, and genuine willingness to engage with the hardest questions, produced something that the briefing room does not always produce. It produced trust. Not agreement. Not endorsement. Trust. The specific. Earned trust of people who believe that the person answering their questions is telling them the truth about what she knows. What they did not see, what the cameras in the briefing room were not designed to capture, was what that trust cost to produce every single day. There is a version of Dana Perino's story that the media biography tends to tell. The small-town girl who made good, the unlikely Washington insider. The calm under pressure. The second woman to hold one of the most visible communications positions in the American government. That version is accurate. The version underneath it is about a marriage that was being tested in real time by the demands of a career that left almost nothing available for the relationship that was supposed to be the center of her private life. She had married Peter McMahon in 1998. He was a British businessman, significantly older than she was. A man whose life was organized around his own professional world and whose patience with the demands of Washington was genuine but finite. He was not American. He did not have the native investment in American political culture that makes the sacrifices of a Washington career feel, to the person making them, like they are in service of something worth the sacrifice. The marriage survived the White House years. It survived the 18-hour days and the constant travel and the emotional bandwidth that the job consumed so completely that there was, by her own account, very little left at the end of any given day for the person waiting at home. It survived because Peter McMahon chose to let it survive. Because he made the calculation, repeatedly, that the woman he had married was worth the accommodation that the woman's career required. Because he understood that the work was not simply a job to her, but a calling, and that callings make demands that jobs do not. She has spoken about this, across the years, and in her books and interviews, with a directness that women in her position, Washington insiders, television figures, people whose public image is carefully managed, do not always deploy. She has said that the marriage was hard, that Peter's patience was a gift she was aware of receiving, that the cost of the career on the relationship was real, and that the relationship survived it not because it was easy, but because they both decided, repeatedly, to make it survive. She has also spoken, with equal directness, about the specific grief of having deferred the decision about having children until the decision was made by biology rather than by choice. She did not have children. She has said, in various contexts, that this is among the most painful of the things the career cost her, that the years consumed by Washington left the question open for too long, that by the time the window for deciding was at its clearest, the career was at its most demanding, and that the choice she made to stay in the career produced a loss that she has carried and continues to carry within. Honesty that her public image does not require her to share, but that she has shared anyway. Have you ever made a choice that you understood at the time would cost you something you could not fully account for, and discovered, only years later, when the full accounting arrived, that the cost was larger than you had been able to see from inside the choice? That is not a question about politics or about women's lives in particular. It is the question that sits underneath Dana Perino's story in its most private chapter. And the fact that she has answered it honestly, in public is one of the more courageous things in her public record. The biggest crisis in Dana Perino's professional life arrived not through the White House briefing room, but through the accumulated weight of what the White House briefing room had required. When the Bush administration ended in January 2009 and she left the podium for the last time, she was 36 years old. She had spent her entire adult working life in service of institutions and administrations whose agenda she had agreed to communicate and defend. The communication skill was unquestioned. The reputation was earned. The credential second woman White House press secretary was permanent, what she was also, in January 2009. Was exhausted in the specific way of people who have been performing at maximum capacity for years without adequate recovery time. Not burned out in the dramatic sense, depleted in the quieter, more fundamental sense of someone who has been drawing on reserves without replenishing them. She moved to Fox News. She became a contributor, then a co-host of The Five, then the anchor of America's newsroom. She wrote books, and the good news is, let me tell you about Jasper. Everything will be okay. She built, in the years after the White House, a media career that was both commercially successful and personally sustaining in ways that the White House had not been able to be. She also, in those years, began to talk differently. The Washington persona contained, professional, carefully calibrated to never give more than the situation required, began to give way, in her writing and in the less formal contexts of her television work, to something more personal. She talked about the marriage, about the childlessness, about her faith, which had deepened during the White House years in ways she described as directly connected to the experience of standing at a podium in front of the world and knowing, daily, that what she had to offer was genuinely insufficient to the size of the moment. She became, over the years since the White House, one of the more genuinely open public figures in American media. Not in the confessional way of people who have lost control of their own narrative and are managing the fallout. In the deliberate way of someone who has decided that the openness is itself a form of service. The central irony of Dana Perino's career is this: the woman who spent 15 years in Washington learning to communicate for other people, to speak for administrations and presidents and institutions, to put the best available face on the most contested situations, to serve as the human conduit between power and the public, found her most authentic voice in the years after she stopped speaking. For anyone but herself. The person she was before the career, the Colorado girl who paid attention to how things were communicated, who fell in love with the craft before she had a context, for it turned out to be the most valuable version of who she was all along. In 2026, Dana Perino is 53 years old. She is a co-anchor of America's Newsroom on Fox News. She hosts Dana Perino's Book Club. She is one of the most recognizable faces in American cable television. With an audience that spans the political spectrum in ways that political media figures rarely achieve, people who disagree with her politics find her fair, and people who agree with her politics trust her, and the combination of those two things is, in the landscape of American media, genuinely rare. She and Peter McMahon are still married, 28 years, as of 2026. He has continued to live with her, accommodate her schedule, and support her work with the patience that she has publicly credited as one of the primary enabling conditions of everything she has built. He is not a public figure. He does not seek to be. He is the stable private center of a very public life, and the stability is real and earned, and the product of choices he has made and continues to make. She talks about her dog, Jasper, and the dog that came after Jasper, with a warmth that her audiences have come to understand is not a brand affectation, but a genuine expression of what the relationship with an animal provides to a person whose human relationships have been, for decades, complicated by the demands of public life. She wrote a book about it. The book was not frivolous, it was honest. She is, at 53, in what she has described as the most settled and most genuinely satisfying chapter of her career, doing work that she finds meaningful. In a context she has chosen, for an audience she has earned, with a private life that she has made sustainable in ways it was not during the White House years. She is, at 53, in what she has described as the most settled and most genuinely satisfying chapter of her career, doing work that she finds meaningful, in a context she has chosen, for an audience she has earned, with a private life that she has made sustainable in ways it was not during the White House years. The Fox News platform has given her something the White House never gave her: the ability to be, professionally, recognizably herself. The positions are her own, the voice is her own. The audience is hers, not borrowed from an administration, not contingent on a president's approval rating, not subject to the daily recalibration that speaking for power requires. There is something quietly remarkable about that image: a woman of 53 who came from Canyon City, Colorado, with no connections and no credential pedigree, who stood at the podium of the White House and held the line every day, who carried losses she did not fully name until years later, and who found, in the chapter after the most visible chapter, a way of being publicly herself that is more complete and more honest than anything the White House required her to be. Dana Perino's story is not a story about politics. It is not a story about the Bush administration or the Iraq War or the specific ideological positions that her public career has been associated with or opposed to, depending on which side of the American political divide you are standing on when you look at it. It is a story about the cost of communication as a vocation, about what it takes to spend decades being the person who gives other people's most difficult truths to the world in a form they can receive. About the specific toll of being always, professionally, the translator between what power knows and what the public is allowed to understand. About what that translation costs the translator over the course of a career, in the private hours, in the relationships, in the deferred questions about children and time, and the life that the career was consuming. It is also a story about what becomes available on the other side of that cost. About the voice that emerges when the translation work is done and you are finally speaking in your own language, to your own audience, about your own experience. About the specific freedom of a public figure who has earned the right, through years of service to something larger than themselves, to be finally, completely, unreservedly themselves. We live in a world that asks certain people in roles of public service, roles of communication, roles that require speaking for others, to set their private selves aside in service of the public function. And we rarely ask what that setting aside costs, what it takes from the person who does it, what they find when they finally pick their private self back up, has changed in the years they set it down. Dana Perino picked hers back up. What she found was that the self she had set aside was still entirely there. It had been waiting. What have you been setting aside for the job, for the role, for the responsibility that other people depend on you to perform, that is waiting for you to pick it back up? And what would it look like to be, finally, in the chapter where you are speaking in your own voice? Leave that in the comments. Because that question is not about Washington or Fox News or press briefings. It is about the version of yourself that has been quietly waiting for its turn. If this story moved something in you, leave a like. 1 second. It means this story reaches someone who needs it. Subscribe. More stories like this are coming, lives that served first and found themselves after. And tell me in the comments, what is the one thing from Dana Perino's story you carry forward? Because the most important thing she ever communicated was not at the White House podium. It was in the chapter after, when the questions were finally her own, and the answers were finally hers to give. We'll be back.